Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. My name is Carolyn Knight. I am the Education and Outreach Specialist for the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and this morning on Birding Basics, we are talking about identification. So you've got all of the supplies and equipment you need to go birding. You've already noticed that there are birds around and that they're actually pretty cool animals to check out. They're always up to something interesting. You've got your binoculars, you've got your field guides, you've even set up your eBird account so you can keep track of all of your birds, and you've learned how to be an ethical and responsible birder. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, the actual birding itself, the fun part. So birders are masters of recognition. They are excellent at the fine details, picking apart what makes each bird the bird itself, what sets them apart from what may otherwise look like identical tiny little brown animals just hopping around and scratching at seed or leaves. But what's also important to remember is, as birders, we're not watching or paying attention to static things. Birds are twitchy. They startle easily. They're always on the lookout for predators. They don't want to just be sitting ducks, if you'll pardon that expression. So when you're birding, it's a really good practice to be able to take a quick glance of a bird and collect as much information as you can, because even if you don't necessarily know it off of the top of your head, you aren't able to identify it with a snap of your fingers, you want to be able to collect as much identifying information from that quick glimpse that you get, whether it's with your bare eyes, whether it's through your binoculars, before you crack out the field guides and get started on figuring out what bird it is you've actually spotted. Because, once again, they don't always stick around for you. In fact, they can be incredibly uncooperative, rather, particularly if you are in a field trip setting. For anyone that's led a field trip, you know the frustration of trying to point out a really cool bird to the people that you're leading, and then it immediately flies away. So, today we're going to be talking about the basics of identification, some tools that will help you get better at the identification, make that a faster and more accurate process for you, and hopefully we'll learn a little bit about some of our neighborhood and local birds in the process. So, one of the most important things to remember about birding is not just that the birds move, but we are birding out in nature, which means the conditions are variable. You're not going to see the exact same lighting, even if you're visiting the same location each and every day, and lighting can be incredibly important, especially when we're dealing with things like vermiculated feathers, which based on the light conditions can look darker or lighter, iridescence, which the angle at which you're viewing that bird can change the colors, and the birds themselves can be cryptic. They don't want to be spotted, once again, so they may have camouflage that helps them blend in. Their coloration may make them, if they are choosing to stay really stock still, make it incredibly difficult to spot them. So, it's important for us to remember that we can't just have one identifying characteristic to help us identify a bird. We often see when we're trying to, say for example, take a picture of a bird, if it's up in a tree, you get a really good view of the bird's butt. Now that's not a helpful identifying characteristic for most birds, unless you're, say for example, looking at a yellow-rumped warbler, in which case, accurately named species, that doesn't always hold true, but their rump is bright yellow. So, as birders, we kind of have to create a grab bag of, these are features that help me identify this bird, and if I can't get the right angle to see one of them, I at least have other traits to fall back on. And those aren't necessarily things that are defined by the appearance of the birds. Sometimes it's behavior. Sometimes it's the way a bird is flying. We can identify, at least to a general family group, things like hawks or vultures, seeing them soaring up in the sky. The fact that they're not beating their wings in order to stay aloft tells us a great deal. The movements of a hummingbird are completely unique to hummingbirds, and it might not get you the exact species of hummingbird, particularly if you're in an area like we are here in the Bay Area where there are multiple species that we could possibly see, but it'll at least get you into the family, and from there you can parse it down. Of course, song, the sounds, whether they're calls or actual full-length songs, is another really great way to identify a species of bird. I believe this week Matthew is picking apart birdsong in his Ask Bird Guy video, so I'm going to leave that to him to discuss in more detail. But today I want to start us off with the impressions of a bird. If you just get a quick glimpse of a bird, what can you take from it? And a lot of this comes down to how a bird is shaped, what its proportions are, how does it hold itself, its posture. And these can be unique to family groups or even down to a species itself. For example, ruby-crowned kinglets, and in fact all kinglets, have a habit of, while they're jumping through trees, they flutter their wings a lot. They'll find a perch, and oftentimes their perch is upside down because they're trying to find bugs that are crawling around in the tree branches and amongst the leaves, but that fluttering wings, it's almost a frantic movement that catches your eye, can actually be more helpful in figuring out what that is than actually getting a clear look at this very tiny and often drably colored bird. So one of the great tools to use for this when you're practicing are actually silhouettes. Now, I've got two here, and even without colors, any details, we can tell which sort of birds these are, at least down to a family. We've got our pigeons and doves up here, and then egrets and herons. And while these are distinctive families, these features that we're familiar with but don't necessarily think about are something that we kind of need to tap into as birders. These impressions that we're not really registering that we're thinking about it, but these birds, the body shape is incredibly definitive. The small head and deep chest of our pigeons, that really long S-shaped neck that our herons and our egrets are sporting, as well as that incredibly long, sharp beak. Now, we can tell what sort of birds these are even without all of the flashy colors and movement that might otherwise distract us out in the field. So just being familiar with silhouettes, how the birds are put together, how that means they move, is an incredibly valuable tool and something that's worth spending time on, even if you just look at that and you're just like, Carolyn, you got cutouts of birds. Like, that's not exciting or interesting, but it is a really good tool, and it can help you narrow things down. Now, your field guides are often really helpful in this, and where these things are placed in your field guides depends on which field guide you're using. In Nat Geo, the front cover basically gives you a visual index, a breakdown of bird families. And of course, because the passerines are just so varied, they have the entire back cover to themselves. And those are our perching songbirds, if you're not familiar with that. Sibley's does this a little bit differently. With each start of the families, they'll have a breakdown of all of the birds that are included in it. So you get to see all of the commonalities of these birds side by side, so that you can figure out, well, what makes a dove a dove? What are these shared characteristics that even if they're living in different habitats, even if they're different colors, they still share these characteristics? And so that's something that I really encourage you to pay attention to. Now, another part of this is posture, how the bird is holding its tail or its wings, how it's going to be moving its body around, its head around. One of the really great examples in our yard birds is the Buick's wren. Now, these little guys are incredibly ornery. They've got a ton of attitude. They're a really great bird to be familiar with because they're often nesting in shrubby yards. Wrens are a great little bird to find nesting in your yard because they'll nest pretty much anywhere if they can find a little cavity. So that's actual nest boxes, holes in trees. If you've got a watering can that has been left defunct for a while, they'll take up residents in there to raise their young. But a really definitive characteristic about these guys is their bodies are basically shaped like a check mark. So you've got the line of their back and their head, and that's usually pretty straight, and then that tail is just flicked up. And that distinct angle from body to tail is a really great marker to be aware of. How they hold themselves will tell you whether or not you're looking at a wren, and there's multiple species of wrens, so you're going to have to parse things out with field marks a little further, but at least you're in the right ballpark. Now, another good one for our yard birds is our white-breasted nuthatch. Now, nuthatches are a really fantastic bird to learn about. They're kind of secretive. They keep close to tree trunks and tree branches. They're gleaning insects off of the surface of the wood with that sharp pointed beak. But like our Buick's wren, they have a very distinct posture. And part of this posture is that they often hang upside down. But they keep their bodies really close to whatever it is they're perched on. Whether it's a tree trunk, whether it is a suet feeder, they're going to keep their bodies nice and close, but they'll stick their heads up. They're always surveying around, keeping an eye out for any predators so that they can make a quick escape. So that's another really good bird to just be aware of, its posture. And here in the Bay Area, we've got 3 species of these guys: white-breasted, red-breasted, and then pygmy. So you are going to once again have to go to your field marks, to your field guide to figure out which exact nuthatch you've seen. But if you're ballparking it, you've got a choice of 3 birds instead of, well, all of this. So we're trying to make things a little bit easier. Now, another important thing to notice, and I'm really happy I'm doing this in the spring and the summertime, because we have alternate plumages right now. Birds are in their breeding plumages. They are wearing their finest colors because they want to attract attention, or at least most of the males do. So color is a really important one, but it's not always reliable depending on what season you're in. But one of these birds is our western bluebird. Now, this is a male. The females are a little bit less colorful, but take a look at this guy. He's absolutely gorgeous. He's got that rusty red, it's almost a robin red chest and back, and that bright, bright blue head and wings that just attracts your attention. Now, that blue is caused by iridescence. It's not a blue pigment, but that does mean it catches the light, and it's incredibly vibrant. Now, this is a great bird to know. It's definitely a neighborhood bird, especially if you're living near a park or a schoolyard. They love foraging in grasslands, so they'll be finding insects in the grass that they'll be bringing back to their nests, which may be in nest boxes, they may be in cavities in trees. They're cavity nesting birds, so they do have to have that hole in order to build their nests and raise their young. And one of my favorite birds, and this is a seasonal migrant, our western bluebirds are residential. They are here year-round, but they're not nearly as colorful. And this one is our hooded oriole. Now, these birds do not winter with us in California, but they are summer visitors. They're absolutely gorgeous birds, about the size of a robin, but just take a look at the colors on these guys. It's a fairly large bird, and they are bright orange, so they stand out. If you've got fan palms in your neighborhood, I really do recommend you take a look, take a moment to watch them each day, because they are the favored nesting grounds for these gorgeous birds. They chatter, they make a lot of noise, they will visit your hummingbird feeders. If you've got orange trees and fan palms, sorry about that, in your neighborhood, these guys are going to be visiting. But a really distinctive marker for these birds is that bright yellow-orange color. Now, the females aren't quite as bright, but you can see the similar markings. It's more of an olive yellow color rather than the bright yellow-orange that our male is sporting. But you can still tell that's a very bright bird, and it's going to catch your eye if you see it flying around. So, that brings us, now that we've covered impressions and the colors, that brings us to the field marks. This is the nitty-gritty of birding. This is the point where you get people arguing about all sorts of really fun terminology, and by fun I mean no, it's not. But once again, your field guides are here to rescue you. So this is the front cover of the Sibley's, and you notice that while we've got some lovely drawings of birds, lark sparrows in particular, there's a whole bunch of lines coming off of them, and each of those lines are labels. Now, Nat Geo does the same thing. It's important to note that these labels don't all apply to the same sorts of birds, so you're going to be using different terminology for birds like ducks than you would our sparrows. But once again, I'm going to suggest spending some time with your field guide just so you learn the language of basically the bird topography, which feathers are called what, and that helps you if you're trying to describe a bird to someone. One of the best practices for learning your birds better is to be able to describe them. And if you're trying to describe a bird in the hopes of someone kind of helping you with that identification, telling you what that mystery bird is, knowing some of that terminology, being aware of what the feather groups are called is going to really help you get that identification down. So, field marks are important. They're the details of your bird. It breaks down to what colors, what markings are visible on what parts of the body. Now these can be things like wing bars, so stripes that appear on the coverts of the wings, whether they're folded or when they're in flight. These can be things like eye rings or eye stripes. A number of our sparrows have what's called mustachial lines, and they look like what they sound like, which is always a plus. It's an advantage for us. But it's basically that bird looks like is kind of sporting a handlebar mustache. Your field guides are your friends. They're going to be breaking down these field marks for you, and oftentimes they're going to point out those field marks to you. That'll have little tiny notes on the sides of those illustrations that'll basically show you what you should be looking for. So if we're looking at our white-throated sparrow, they're going to be pointing out that it's got that white throat. That yellow spot is in an area that we refer to as the lores. So it's right between the eye and the beak. And these are going to be what lets you figure out what species in particular you're looking at. Once you've figured out the families, once you've gotten a general idea of what sort of bird you're looking at, your field marks are going to be what sets that bird apart from all of the rest of the birds in its family. And sometimes they're really straightforward. The white-throated sparrow's got a bright white throat, as well as a black and white striped crown, and that really evident yellow spot on the lores. But sometimes the birds are a little bit more detailed. If you want to give yourself a headache, I recommend checking out the Epidanax flycatchers in your field guide. We tell those apart by song, unless you have the bird in hand and can do some measurements. Some really tiny measurements with calipers. So what field marks you're looking at does depend on what species you're talking about. So today, the yard bird I want to talk to you guys about is one that doesn't have a ton of field marks. So this guy is our California towhee. This is, unlike our dark-eyed junco, it doesn't have a really wide range. You'll spot them in southern Oregon, all throughout California, or the majority of California, and down into Baja. But not a particularly wide-ranging bird. It's a really great bird to have on your list if you're a western birder. If you're an East Coast birder and you're coming to visit, make sure you nab a California towhee. They're a bird that in its native habitat is going to be found in the scrub, in bushes and chaparral, but they've adapted really well to our yards, especially if you've got a lot of bushes or shrubbery around. if you've got a yard that has mulch in it, these are the birds that are most likely responsible for throwing that mulch all over your pathway and sidewalk. And that's because they're ground foraging birds with a very specific foraging technique. It's called kick scratching. They're going to use their really strong feet and long claws to essentially jump at the ground and tear up things like leaves and bark in order to uncover any seeds or insects that might be hiding. These birds are also going to be taking advantage of things like our berries. So if you've got anything from poison oak, and these guys really do enjoy using poison oak to protect their nests. They like to nest on the ground with lots of cover, and poison oak is perfect for that. It is the bane of California's outdoor activities because it's everywhere, but it does provide really important habitat and food for our native wildlife, so you can't complain about it too much, even if it is incredibly itchy. So if you've got those in your yard or where you're living, it's very likely that you're going to be spotting our California towhee. But many of us are actually relatively familiar with this bird, at least through its call. Now, it's got a really distinctive call. It's this metallic cheeping. It's sharp, it doesn't go anywhere, but it does cut through really, really well. So it's something that you've probably heard all your life if you've been living in California, but you may not have been able to put a bird to it, if simply because, I mean, this is the birdiest bird. It's the basic songbird layout, right? You've got that conical beak, but it's kind of a drab brown with the exception of that rusty patch on its vent or the undertail coverts, those feathers that are on the underside of its tail. But these birds are interesting to watch. They're often in mated pairs. They're pretty monogamous, so you very seldom actually find the males performing their songs. They're not a bird that's going to be wandering alone for very long. They mate, they stay mated, they stay in their pair. So we very seldom actually get to hear its call, its mating song in order to attract the mate. But they are super, super territorial, which, if you're in an urban setting, can lead to some interesting behaviors. This is the time of year we notice that if you're parked out on the street where there's lots of birds, our windows and our mirrors of our cars, sometimes there's a lot of whitewash or bird poop on it. And the reason for that is because a territorial bird has noticed its reflection and is now incredibly irate that there is a newcomer in its territory and it is not backing down. So California towhees are really well known for this. Growing up, the neighbors had a car that had incredibly shiny wheels, and we had a towhee that every spring would just spend the entire day posturing in front of its reflection, just incredibly irritated and calling the entire time. So if you cover your mirrors, you don't get bird poop on your car as much, at least from that behavior. But it is something to watch out for, and it can be an interesting thing to watch just how they react to the idea of someone coming into their territory and not backing down. And that's simply because they're not backing down. So that can lead to some exhaustion and extra stress. So it is something that I do recommend you be aware of and try to mitigate if possible. So I hope you guys all have a lovely rest of your week, and I will see you all next week.